They looked like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and deeply in love. But behind their smiles was a secret life built on control, cruelty, and planned violence. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka weren't just hiding what they'd done, they were working together to make it worse. Some parts of this story are almost too disturbing to say out loud, like how before they ever hurt a stranger, Karla offered up her own sister. In this story, we'll follow how their twisted bond grew darker over time, turning a picture-perfect romance into one of the most shocking crime stories ever seen. When evil meets evil, Karla Leanne Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in the lakeside suburb of Port Credit, Ontario. Her upbringing, like many others, looked stable enough on the outside, but beneath the surface was a family marked by volatility. Her father, an immigrant from the former Czechoslovakia, drank heavily and often, and when he did, the household shifted. Arguments with her mother would erupt into chaos, while Karla and her two younger sisters learned to console each other in the aftermath. It was the kind of environment where silence became armor, and where pretending everything was fine was often easier than facing the truth. As a teenager, Karla worked part-time in a pet store, and to those around her she seemed like a normal, spirited girl. Someone who loved animals and had a rebellious streak that felt harmless. But there were small moments that didn't sit right. There was the time, for instance, that she allegedly threw a friend's pet hamster out of a window, killing it instantly. It was passed off as a joke, a strange accident, but it left a mark on those who remembered it. That incident, in hindsight, didn't just feel cruel, it felt telling. Despite that, she excelled in school, earning praise from teachers and maintaining good grades, though classmates described her as controlling and occasionally abrasive. She developed a fascination with crime novels. Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys at first, then darker stories, real ones. By the age of 12, she wasn't just reading about mysteries, she was studying them, folding herself into the logic of violence and obsession with a quiet, focused intensity. Her interest in the macabre deepened over time. She and her friends would dabble in the occult, hold seances, and speak casually about death as if it were something curious rather than final. She dressed how she wanted, acted how she pleased, and rarely cared what others thought. While some saw her as eccentric, none of them imagined that her strange fantasies would one day manifest in something no one could have prepared for. In 1987, at just 17 years old, Karla attended a pet industry convention in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto. It was there, in the most ordinary of settings, that she met Paul Bernardo. He was 23, clean-cut, confident, and had the kind of practiced charm that made him seem older than he was. There was something about him that drew people in, especially young women. What Karla didn't know, or maybe what she didn't care to know, was that Paul had already begun laying the groundwork for the monster he would soon become. From the outside, Paul's life looked picture perfect. His family was well off. He was enrolled at the University of Toronto studying accounting, and he worked as a salesman, skills that sharpened his ability to persuade and manipulate. But, just like Karla's home, his was full of secrets. When Paul was only 9 years old, his father, Kenneth Bernardo, had been charged with abusing a young girl. The family tried to move on, to pretend it hadn't happened, but trauma like that doesn't disappear. It festers. What seemed to affect Paul even more deeply came later. At 16, he learned that Kenneth wasn't his biological father, that his mother had conceived him during an extramarital affair. The revelation cracked something open in him. From that point on, he began lashing out, especially toward his mother, both verbally and physically. Any remaining sense of normalcy started to unravel. While studying at university, Paul discovered he could use his charm to gain trust quickly. He began to seduce women, only to abuse them once they were isolated, beating them, degrading them, and enjoying every second of the power he held over them. It became a pattern. Behind closed doors, he wasn't just violent, he was methodical. He studied techniques, rehearsed his moves. One of his obsessions was the novel American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, a book he read not as fiction, but as inspiration. He idolized the main character's cold detachment and violent control. It wasn't entertainment, it was instruction. So when Paul met Karla, there was no warning, no alarm bells loud enough to drown out the attraction they felt for each other. To everyone else, it looked like a whirlwind romance. But to the few who truly knew them, it would later become clear. They didn't complete each other. They enabled each other. And once they were together, nothing was off limits. Pretty faces, predatory minds. They met in October of 1987, and from the very beginning, there was no pretense, no slow build. That very first night, Karla and Paul slept together. What started as a chance meeting quickly spiraled into something much darker than either of them had likely anticipated. What they discovered as the hours passed and boundaries fell away was that they shared more than physical attraction. Beneath the surface, both of them carried appetites, violent, controlling, obsessive, and instead of frightening one another, those instincts drew them in even closer. What followed wasn't love, not in any traditional sense, but a dynamic built around domination. Paul established himself as the master in their relationship, and Karla, eager to please and perhaps eager to matter, adopted the role of the obedient slave. Their relationship became a cycle of sadism and submission, and to outsiders, there were no obvious signs. On the surface, they were young and attractive, engaged in a whirlwind romance. Behind closed doors, Paul controlled everything, from what Karla wore to how she spoke, and she didn't resist. In fact, she encouraged it. But Paul Bernardo's violence didn't begin with Karla. Months before their meeting, in May of 1987, the quiet suburb of Scarborough, Ontario began to change. In the early hours of May 4th, a young woman was walking home from the bus stop when she was grabbed from behind, dragged into a secluded area near her house, and violently assaulted. She survived, but the attack was brutal, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next week alone, 2 more young women were attacked in nearly identical circumstances. The victims, girls and women between the ages of 15 and 21, were ambushed near their homes, often just steps from safety. The attacks followed a chilling pattern. Beatings, non-consensual acts, and whispered threats meant to keep the victims silent. It didn't take investigators long to realize they were likely dealing with the same man. The media gave him a name, the Scarborough Rapist, and the community went on edge. The assaults happened outdoors. Bus shelters, backyards, dim alleyways. In one case, the attacker followed a woman into her bedroom and assaulted her there. No place felt safe. No one knew when or where he'd strike next. And for nearly 5 years, he didn't stop. Officially, 19 women were attacked between 1987 and 1990, but unofficially, the number may have been much higher. Some survivors fought back. A few managed to escape. 2 even went to the police with enough detail to get Paul on their radar, and yet each time, he slipped through the cracks. Police questioned him twice. Both times he seemed calm, polite, and cooperative. He wasn't the kind of man people suspected. He was clean-cut, articulate. the kind of man who could talk his way out of almost anything. It wasn't until May of 1990, 3 years after the first attack, that a woman came forward with a detailed enough description to catch the attention of investigators again. By November, they brought Paul in for questioning. He didn't resist. He walked into the station voluntarily, sat down with police, and even provided DNA samples. When asked why he thought they might be interested in him, he gave a quiet, almost casual answer. He suspected it might be because he resembled the composite sketch of the suspect. There was no panic in his voice, no sign of guilt or fear. He was released the next day. Outwardly, Paul and Karla's relationship continued to look like something out of a romance novel. They got engaged, posed for pictures, and gave off the appearance of a young couple in love. But Paul's desires were escalating, and he had become obsessed with a new idea, one he couldn't shake. He wanted to essay a virgin. Karla, who had been in a relationship before Paul, no longer fit that mold, and that bothered her. Not because she regretted her past, but because it upset him. Paul became fixated on Karla's younger sister, Tammy. She was 15, blonde like her sister and still innocent. Karla saw how he looked at her, and instead of confronting him or pulling away, she did something far more disturbing. She began to consider how she could give Tammy to him, Canada's deadliest couple. On the night of December 23, 1990, Karla crushed a sedative, halothane, that she had stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked. In fact, she had been quietly stealing large quantities of drugs for some time, giving them to Paul to use during his assaults. This time, the drug wasn't for a stranger. It was for her sister. They waited until the rest of the family had gone to bed. Then they drugged Tammy, filmed the assault, and watched as things spiraled beyond their control. At some point during the night, Tammy began to vomit and choke. The drugs in her system, combined with alcohol, had overwhelmed her body. Karla and Paul panicked. They tried to clean her up, redress her, and hide the evidence. When paramedics arrived, Tammy was unconscious. She never woke up. At the hospital, doctors noted a strange chemical burn on Tammy's face, likely from the halothane mask. But toxicology didn't detect the drugs. Her death was ruled accidental. Cause: choking on her own vomit after drinking. The family grieved. No one suspected anything. No one questioned why Paul and Karla had taken a photo of themselves and placed it in Tammy's coffin. Just 3 weeks after the funeral, the couple recorded a home video titled The Fireside Chat, where they discussed Tammy's death on camera. Karla laughed. Paul boasted. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like triumph. Instead of stopping after Tammy's death, they escalated. That moment wasn't a warning. It was a beginning. They moved into a small, pale house near Lake Ontario in a quiet area of Port Dalhousie, just miles from where Tammy had died. A fresh start, in theory, but the darkness followed them. On June 7, 1991, Karla invited another young girl to the house. This one was 15, someone she had worked with briefly at the pet store. She told the girl they were going to have a fun night. They gave her food, alcohol, and laced it with drugs. When she passed out, Paul assaulted her, and once again they videotaped everything. The next morning, the girl woke up sick, confused, thinking she had just drunk too much for the first time. She had no idea what had really happened to her. Later, that same month, on June 29th, Paul and Karla got married in an elaborate ceremony, complete with a horse-drawn carriage, lace gown, and photos that captured none of what lay beneath the surface. On that very same day, a couple out for a quiet canoe trip on Lake Gibson made a discovery that would rip open everything the newlyweds had tried to hide. They saw concrete blocks floating in the water. Inside were human body parts. The remains belonged to a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey. Leslie had disappeared just 2 weeks before the wedding. On the night of June 15th, she had gone to a friend's wake, trying to process the death of someone she knew. After the memorial, she and a group of friends gathered in the woods to drink. Around 2 a.m., they walked her back toward home. She waved them off outside her house, but when she reached the door, she realized she was locked out. Not wanting to wake her mother, she tried calling another friend from a nearby payphone. No one answered. That night, Paul Bernardo had been in the neighborhood stealing license plates. He spotted Leslie alone and approached her under the guise of offering a cigarette, claiming he had them in his car. When she stepped closer, he threw his sweatshirt over her head and forced her inside the vehicle. Then he brought her home. For the next 24 hours, she was held captive, tortured, assaulted, videotaped. When it was over, she was strangled. Her body was moved from the upstairs bedroom to the basement, hours before Karla's family came over for a visit. They entertained the Homolkas on the main floor, serving food, making small talk, while Leslie's body lay beneath their feet. After the guests left, Paul and Karla dismembered her and encased the remains in concrete. Pressure began to mount. The media reported on Leslie's death. Her remains had been found, and Paul, stressed, paranoid, volatile, turned violent toward Karla. He began beating her regularly, but the abuse didn't stop them. If anything, it pushed them further. By April of the following year, they were hunting again. On the afternoon of April 16, 1992, Paul and Karla were driving through St. Catharines when they spotted a girl walking alone. Her name was Kristen French, 15 years old, a student, a daughter, bright, capable, kind. Paul pulled the car over while Karla stepped out, holding a map, pretending to be lost. When Kristen approached to help, Paul grabbed her from behind, forced her into the car, and drove away. Her parents knew something was wrong almost immediately. Kristen was punctual, responsible. When she didn't come home, they called the police. The Niagara Regional Police responded quickly. Witnesses came forward. Several people had seen the abduction in real time. The investigation moved faster than it had in past cases. Authorities had a clearer picture than before. But by the time they found Kristen, it was too late. She had been murdered by the same couple who had placed a smiling wedding photo in her sister's coffin. The same couple who had filmed themselves laughing about death. The same couple who, for too long, had walked through the world looking like a fairy tale, when the truth was far closer to a nightmare. 3 days after she vanished, Kristen French's body was discovered in a ditch roughly 45 minutes from where she had last been seen. She was naked, bruised, and left without care or dignity. It was April 30th, 1992. The horror she endured during those missing days would only become clear later, through the confessions, the videotapes, and the trial. But by then it would be too late. 12 days after Kristen's body was found, on May 12th, a sergeant with the Niagara Regional Police sat down for a brief interview with Paul Bernardo. The officer noted Paul's calm demeanor and decided, perhaps based on instinct or bias or exhaustion, that he didn't fit the profile. Even when Paul admitted, offhandedly, that he had once been questioned in connection with the Scarborough rapist investigation, the interview didn't deepen. The officer let him go. The report barely raised concern. At the same time, Paul and Karla were trying to vanish in another way. They applied to have their names legally changed, from Bernardo and Homolka to T. Lay. Paul had taken the name from a character in the film Criminal Law. He hadn't even gotten the name right. But the meaning was clear. He wanted to reinvent himself, to distance their new life from the one that had begun to unravel. The tapes, the trial, and the woman who walked free. In December of that year, Paul's violent outbursts turned inward again. This time, it wasn't a stranger or a victim, it was Karla. He beat her with a flashlight until her face was swollen and bruised, a pattern of rage that had now become routine. Karla went to work the next morning and claimed that she'd been in a car accident. Her co-workers didn't believe her. The injuries were too severe, too specific, and too fresh. They alerted her parents, and it was her parents who came to the house and physically removed her. She resisted at first, frantic, panicked. She rushed back into the house, searching for something she wouldn't name. She didn't find it. The thing she had been looking for, something she hoped to retrieve before it fell into the wrong hands, was a set of videotapes. Tapes that recorded everything. Tapes that Paul had already hidden. Karla was taken to St. Catherine's General Hospital, where her injuries were photographed and documented. She told police that she had been abused for years, that she was afraid for her life, and that Paul had controlled every part of her existence. She filed charges. Paul was arrested, but released on his own recognizance shortly after. 2 months later, in February of 1993, Toronto police received the DNA results from the samples Paul had provided years earlier. The match was undeniable. Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist. Karla was brought in again, this time by detectives who knew they were closing in. During her interviews, she began to open up, slowly at first, offering partial confessions laced with self-preservation. She claimed Paul was cold and distant, that their marriage had never been real, that he had treated her like an object from the very beginning. She told them about the violence, about the threats, about the fear that had governed her every move. She described the murders, not with remorse, but with a kind of numb detachment. She claimed she watched as Paul strangled Kristen French, that she felt nothing, because Kristen was already gone. She described putting on makeup with Kristen, talking like friends, laughing, pretending, and then she told police that Paul had violated more than 30 women, that she had helped, that she had watched. With the walls closing in, Karla obtained legal representation and began negotiating a deal with the Crown. The plea bargain offered her a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against Paul. She claimed she had never wanted to participate, that Paul had forced her, manipulated her, threatened her life. She leaned hard into the narrative of the battered wife. She told investigators about his control, his rituals, the punishments, how he would force her to kneel in the center of the bedroom, stare straight ahead while he circled her, kicking her without warning. How she was never allowed to flinch, never allowed to prepare. She said he trained her to smile in front of her parents, to pretend everything was fine. If she slipped, if she let the mask crack, he'd punish her later. On May 14, 1993, Karla's plea agreement was finalized. She began giving full statements to the police. She played the only card she had left. But then, something happened that would change everything. Inside the house, hidden in the upstairs bathroom behind a light fixture, investigators discovered a set of videotapes. Paul had told them where to look. Whether it was arrogance or a calculated move, no one knows for sure, but the tapes were found, and everything changed. The videos showed the truth. They showed Karla not as a frightened, coerced bystander, but as an active participant. She wasn't forced, she wasn't pleading, she was laughing. She was orchestrating, she was present for everything, from the drugging of Tammy Homolka to the assaults of multiple girls. She looked into the camera, she followed instructions. Sometimes she gave them. The plea deal by then had already been signed. Her sentence was set. 12 years, no chance of reconsideration. The public reaction would be one of fury. They called it the deal with the devil. And as the tapes played behind closed doors in courtrooms and police stations, the truth was impossible to ignore. Karla hadn't been a prisoner. She had been a partner. Paul Bernardo's conviction depended almost entirely on Karla Homolka's testimony. Her story had to be believed, not just by investigators, but by the public. In order to preserve her credibility as a witness, they cast her as a victim. Someone caught in the orbit of a manipulative, predatory man. Someone coerced into participating. Someone who had no choice. In doing so, her own responsibility for the crimes they committed together was not erased, but it was, for a time, softened. The version of Karla that the public was shown was meant to evoke sympathy, but behind closed doors, glimpses of her real disposition slipped through. When she accompanied detectives back to the house on Bayview Avenue, the very place where 2 teenage girls had been held, assaulted, and murdered, she didn't show remorse or hesitation. Instead, she asked questions about her furniture. In the bedroom where Leslie Mahaffey was tortured and murdered, she turned to an officer and said, "Can you answer a question for me? Was any of the furniture damaged as a result of the investigation?" Later, in the bathroom where Kristen French's body had been cleaned of evidence, she expressed concern over missing items. Not evidence, but perfume samples. "I don't have any of that stuff. From what I understand, his lawyer took basically everything." In the basement, where Leslie had been dismembered, she voiced another concern, this time on behalf of her younger sister, Lori. "Can I ask you a question? I'm afraid I can't do this. My sister wants it. Does that have to stay in there?" Her detachment, her self-interest, was jarring. And once the tape surfaced, revealing Karla not as a passive observer but an active participant, the public outrage exploded. The deal she had struck with the Crown, 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after just 3, was seen for what it was: a miscarriage of justice. The press dubbed it the pact with the devil. Paul Bernardo was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and non-consensual acts. On September 1, 1995, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. He would never walk free again. But even as he sat behind bars, Paul continued to deny responsibility for the murders. He blamed Karla, claimed she had murdered them, claimed that while he had committed non-consensual acts, he had never murdered anyone until she came into his life. In rambling letters and recorded interviews, he tried to recast himself as the follower, not the leader, a man manipulated by a woman he claimed was the true mastermind. Karla, for her part, was never initially charged with Tammy Homolka's death. That came later, after she admitted in a letter to her parents that she had played a direct role in drugging and killing her younger sister. For that confession, an additional 2 years were added to her sentence. 2 years for the death of her own sibling. Her time in prison was not what many expected. She was placed in a minimum security. She changed her name to Leanne Bordelais, married her lawyer's brother, Thierry Bordelais, and had 3 children. She moved to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe for a time before settling back in Canada, eventually residing in the Montreal area. In 2010, she became eligible for a full pardon, one that would have wiped her criminal record clean. The public backlash was swift and loud, and the government responded by changing the law. But the fact that it had ever been possible was enough to send a chill through anyone who had followed the case. Beyond the verdict. Today, Karla lives in Quebec. Parents have protested her presence near schools. In 2020, there was a public outcry after she was seen volunteering at her children's school in Montreal's NDG district. When approached by a news reporter outside, she refused to answer questions. "My lawyer will be in contact with you," she said before closing the door. Paul, meanwhile, remains incarcerated. His first parole hearing was in 2018. It lasted less than 30 minutes. He was denied. He continues to serve his sentence at Millhaven Institution and has since admitted to at least 10 additional assaults that occurred throughout the 1980s. some investigators believe he may have been responsible for more than that. One case in particular has drawn attention: the disappearance of Elizabeth Bain in June of 1990. 3 weeks after Paul's last known attack as the Scarborough rapist, Elizabeth vanished from the University of Toronto's Scarborough campus. Her blood was found and recovered. Her boyfriend at the time, Robert Baltovich, was charged and later convicted of her murder, spending 8 years in prison before being exonerated. A man resembling Paul Bernardo had reportedly been seen near the campus on the day she disappeared. In 2006, police questioned Paul about Bain's case. He denied knowing Elizabeth, denied having anything to do with her disappearance, but stopped short of offering a clear denial. "It's a loaded question," he said when asked if he had murdered her. "There's a lot of issues about that." He offered nothing useful. He always stopped just short of confession. To this day, Elizabeth Bain's body has never been found. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka remain two of the most reviled criminals in Canadian history. They blamed each other for everything, and in a way they were both right. They needed each other, enabled each other, fed off one another. Paul remains locked away, likely for life. Karla walks free. And while the justice system tried to make sense of it all, the public never truly forgave what happened. The crimes, the lies, or the deal that let one of them disappear into the world again, leaving the rest of us to remember what they did. A love story born in hell, and one that should have ended there.